in today's video we're going to look at structured adjustment programs, and this is relevant for year 12 in terms of development and why some countries are switched off, and it's also relevant for year 13 in terms of power and why some countries have power and others don't. So I'm going to go through this quite briefly because it's quite a discursive topic, but hopefully it'll give you that background that when you read in the textbooks or when you do any additional reading, when you watch any TED Talks, because there's quite a lot of TED Talks about this, then you'll be a little bit more informed on what's happening and what they're talking about. So an SAP is a structured adjustment program, and essentially they come in the form of loans. Now we know that the IMF and the World Bank, but mostly here we're kind of talking about the World Bank. The World Bank gives poorer countries money to invest in maybe big infrastructure projects, etc. We'll talk about some other things in a minute. But it gives them loans in order to help them get out of poverty, to lift them out of poverty, to get them trading rather than being dependent on aid, which we know can be a really good idea in terms of developing a country. But we're just going to look at some of the pros and cons of this and the development, how the SAPs have evolved because of a lot of criticism about them. So this is the IMF and the World Bank giving poorer countries, mostly LICs, low-income countries who are in crisis, and they've got very little amounts of development, they've got a lot of poverty, etc. They're not meeting their Millennium Development Goals by any way, so the World Bank is there to give them a loan. So we might think that is good, and it can be used to help a country out of poverty and to develop that country, to change its financial institutions, to move it from state-run institutions to privatised institutions, and we know that that's worked in the West. We know in the UK a lot of our businesses are now privatised, that open door policy. We know that FDI works in China, it's been seen to work there in India and the other BRICS. So we can understand why this might seem like a good idea. However, it's not always a good idea, because what goes with it is it says here, enforced policies. Now, the World Bank will insist on certain things that the poorer country has to agree to. Otherwise, it will fall foul of some very heavy kind of fiscal discipline if it doesn't. So it has to comply with what the World Bank wants it to do. So the World Bank doesn't just give it the money and say, do what you like with it and develop. The World Bank says, right, we've given you this money, but we're going to tell you what you can and can't spend that money on. Now, that might seem like a good idea, so they don't squander it, so you haven't got corrupt governments using that. However, in lots of sub-Saharan African countries, we've seen over time that that's generally not a good idea, because each country is different. Each country has different natural resources. Each country has different amounts of skilled or unskilled labour. Each country is different in terms of its physical location, its climate, the amount of agriculture it's got, the amount of natural resource and what those natural resources are, and how corrupt or how not corrupt, what good governance that country's got. So it's kind of a one-size-fits-all that the World Bank implements with telling the country what it can and what it can't spend its money on. So it hasn't had a mass of success, because that implementation of those parameters is dictated to by the World Bank. So it's been heavily criticised. And you might think that trade is good, but the outcomes aren't always great. So that is what the SAPs are. So in recent years, the World Bank has seen that it's not having such great success. We've still got many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, South America, Asia, who still are way under the levels of development that they need to be, are still not meeting those minimum characteristics in terms of towards gaining ground towards the Millennium Development Goals in terms of fresh water, access to education, women in education, that kind of thing. So they've come up with another development of those SAPs, which are PRSPs, and they are Poverty Reduction Strategy Papers. These are a newer initiative, and here the difference is the local government is now a lot more involved in what happens. They've got more of a say in terms of what they can and what they can't spend that money on, to a certain extent. So they draw up the policies with the local government, which in theory should lead to greater ownership and more targeted development. However, what it does tend to lead to is a lack of sovereignty or a loss of sovereignty because it's still being dictated to from outside. And also, quite often, it leads to multinationals coming in and exploiting resources that the country can't exploit by itself. So again, it's still not ideal, it's still not working. So some of the things that the World Bank might insist on is removal of subsidies, especially for farming. So in its view, it's putting everything on a level playing field, so it becomes more open to trading. That's not always a good idea because often these countries can't trade freely with other countries because other countries like the EU, countries in the EU do have subsidies, so you can't compete if your crop hasn't got a subsidy and another country's crop has got a subsidy. It just doesn't work. You can have opening of markets, which is possibly a good thing. We can have privatisation, which you could argue is good because privatisation means that you get FDI, and that FDI can help your country develop and help the economy develop. We've seen it happen in the UK and China and India, so we can't say that that's really negative. But it quite often can be to the detriment of that local government because the multinational come in and kind of take over. It can have to lead to new institutions being opened there, which again leads to a loss of sovereignty. It can help fight corruption, which is never a bad thing. So these countries can often be quite corrupt. So the World Bank can come in and say you have to sort that out before you get a loan. So that is going to be a good thing, obviously. It leads to better governance as well, which means that the country is given help to govern itself more effectively. So that's a positive. But it can also lead to just the extraction of a lot of its natural resources in terms of multinationals coming in and doing that because the technology just isn't there for the countries to do it itself. So these SAPs or PRSPs have pros and cons. Now, if we're looking at this in terms of year 12, then we can be arguing that these SAPs are keeping poorer countries in poverty because the World Bank isn't doing enough to help them trade and get out of poverty. If we're looking at it in terms of year 13 and power, then we can see that it's these institutions that have power, and these institutions are the ones who are making most of the money and dictating the terms that these SAPs or PRSPs are implemented under. So we can argue that this just keeps power in the West, and that sub-Saharan African countries in particular are always going to be switched off for the foreseeable future because of these SAPs, because of the structure of what they're forced to do or not able to do themselves. So that is SAPs.